And without further ado, to moving to the topic of the day, David Rowat will be our next speaker, and he's going to present some very interesting trends that they've found through their research working with some prestigious business schools across the country. And we'll be one of the first groups to have this information shared with us. So we're grateful for that and look forward to a lot of learning today. So let's bring David Rowat to the floor. David, good afternoon, and thank you for being here. At the risk of taking as much time as I did getting through Basil's resume, yours is about the same length. So I'm going to abbreviate that just a little bit for you, but suffice it to say that you have a rich history of working with companies in various senior executive roles, and have assisted at the chief CFO, CEO level, COO level, over 70 companies in the past 30 years. So great background. You're from Canada, and then a bachelor's degree from University of Waterloo and a master's from University of British Columbia. And you have an MBA with honors from the Harvard Business School, and you're a publisher, and we're going to share with a comprehensive website on board governance that you have as well. And it's a sheer pleasure to have you, David. Thank you for your time, and the floor is yours. We look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. Yes, I have worked for 70 different companies, and several of those Basil was running. You mentioned Nexus Engineering, and that was the first job I had out of the business school. Basil hired me on in a vice presidential capacity, saying, "I'm not sure what you're going to do, Dave, but we'll try and figure it out." And 6 years later, we were still trying to figure it out, but I certainly had an opportunity to learn a lot with Basil, and we've worked together continuously at various times over the years, and I'm very proud to be a member of the Strategic Exits team. So we're going to talk about some of our early research into virtual companies, why they sell for more money, and why the founders can keep more of it. So what we see at Strategic Exits is a paradigm that's emerging around virtual companies. And we'll need to to distinguish virtual companies from the bricks and mortars companies, many of whom may have a few remote workers. But what distinguishes a virtual company is that it takes remote work to the extreme. All the employees are remote, and the company, in fact, has no physical head office at all. It only exists online. And this type of structure, we believe, is going to be changing the nature of work in the 21st century. And to help us with our research, we've engaged with a professor at the University of British Columbia and his team of PhD students to dig up the data to quantify and confirm our observations. So we're going to be very interested to see what they come up with. But to distinguish why virtual companies sell for more, let's look at some of the differences between virtual companies and bricks and mortar companies. So bricks and mortar companies may have some people working from home, but typically they have physical offices and investment in leases, investments in fixed assets. But a virtual company, everybody is working from anywhere they want to, and there is no head office or lease or assets. They eliminate all of those things. Bricks and mortar companies typically hire in their local market, where virtual companies can hire right from around the globe. And that becomes important when we're talking about some aspects of valuation. Commuting is a fact of life with bricks and mortar companies, but it's completely absent with a virtual company because you can work from your kitchen or from the coffee shop down the street. As a result, the corporate operating costs are lower for virtual companies. In particular, employment costs. Typically, bricks and mortar companies will be hiring employees in North America or in Europe, wherever their headquarters are, at very high labor cost with benefits on top of that. Virtual companies, on the other hand, typically hire contractors, many of whom will be working in offshore locations where the labor costs are much lower, in some cases as low as 10% of what you would pay the equivalent person in the valley. We talked about leases and fixed assets being much lower. The other component is that bricks and mortar companies pay corporate income tax when they make a profit. Virtual companies, if they organize their affairs properly, can minimize the income tax that they pay. So right off the bat, we can see that virtual companies are more profitable than bricks and mortar companies. But there are more aspects of this that are intriguing and affect the differential valuation of bricks and mortar and virtual companies. It stands to reason that if a virtual company has a lower expense burden, then it's much easier to bootstrap. They don't have to raise as much financing, and this has two impacts. The founders spend less time financing, and ultimately there's less dilution for the founders. And this, you'll see in a moment, has a profound effect on valuation. Virtual corporations are agile. They're not constrained by real estate, assets, administrative overhead, as we've talked about. They're much more free to move, as we said, agile. And so they're remotely manageable through constant online communications. And that phrase of online communications we're going to see a couple of times today. But as a result, they're able to make faster decisions and respond more quickly to opportunities. And the prediction is they will quickly grow and disrupt established industries. And we're already starting to see that happen in some places. Virtual corporations can hire the best talent from around the world. If everybody is online, then there are no geographic restrictions, obviously. People could be anywhere. And so that gives virtual companies the opportunity to search the globe to find the best people to fill their positions, and often at a much reduced compensation cost, as we've talked about. And it works both ways. Virtual companies tend to attract the best employees from around the world because they're excited to work in leading edge companies with other world-class best employees. And employees, we've noticed, are preferred. They much prefer to work virtually if they can. Anything to avoid that soul-sucking commute of traveling to and from the office every day. I understand that the average commute in the Valley now is somewhere in the neighborhood of about an hour each way. So you think about that, 2 hours each day, 5 days a week throughout an entire career. It's an incredible waste of valuable time, and it's not terribly good for the environment either. So many employees would actually give up a big chunk of their salary if they had the freedom to work from home, where they have flexible hours and they can plan their work around their lives instead of the other way around, and they achieve a much better work and life balance. It's also true that virtual employees have significantly lower work-related expenses because they're not driving their car very much, they have a smaller wardrobe, and it's much cheaper to make your lunch in the kitchen. Now, the first time I gave this presentation was back in February, before the pandemic had hit. And so it's very timely because we're actually seeing in front of our very eyes the growth of working remotely and working from home, forced on us by the pandemic. And some of the data is starting to come back in already. It's pretty clear that the large office-centric companies where their employees were forced to work from home, many have struggled to adapt to working remotely and online. They're finding it very difficult. And it's not just because the tools are different and the training needs to happen, but it's also very hard to unlearn office protocols which have been baked in over decades, and hard to unlearn those and learn new virtual methods. So there's a lot of struggling that's going on. Interestingly, employees are embracing the virtual advantages much faster than their managers are, and which stands to reason for the advantages of being virtual we talked about before. But for managers, it's a little difficult because they can't see their employees anymore, and so they have to evolve from a command structure to empowering their employees and trusting them, which they should have been doing 2 decades ago, but are only starting to get around to it now, forced into it because of the fact that all their employees are working from home. I think it's fair to say that the large companies are slower to appreciate the value of remote work. Now, over on the other side, let's look at early stage tech companies, the ones that we're more familiar with. There's an outfit called Remote.co, which looks at trends with remote work and virtual companies, and they just finished interviews with about 140 remote companies. When they first did the survey 5 years ago, there was only 25 in their list, so you can see that virtual companies are growing. Among that group of 140, most of the companies are virtual, and almost all of them are early stage tech companies. And for most of these companies and the people that work in them, working virtually is a passion. It's part of their culture. It's part of their identity. It's something that they wear like a badge of honor. Most of these companies are virtual right from startup, and the secret to their management is to have constant communications online frequently, to maintain the culture, to bring people on board, to keep them as part of the decision-making loop, all those things to make them feel part of the team, even though they can be very remote. I think it's also fair to note that tech companies and millennial workers tend to gravitate naturally to remote work. And this really should be no surprise. The millennials are the generation that grew up with telephones in their hands, and they've been communicating online their entire lives. So it's not much of a transition for them to bring online work into the business space. And so the conclusion we can draw from this is that it's much easier to start up a virtual company than to transition an office-centric company to virtual operations. So I want to talk now about some of the aspects of virtual companies that make their founders richer when it comes to exit time. Virtual companies sell for more money, and the founders get to keep more of the proceeds. But before we get there, we need to talk a little bit about tax strategy for cross-border acquisitions, which is important. And I'll finish the talk by talking about a case study that Strategic Exits recently did of selling a virtual company. So the exit is a happy day. You know, the founders get to sell their company to the buyer, who's happy to bring on board new ideas and new people and shower the founders with huge amounts of money. It's a very, very happy day, including for the government, because at exit time, they'll show up and take capital gains and dividend tax, withholding tax, all kinds of transaction taxes, which can amount to 20 to 40% of the entire deal. And in some deals, of course, the government, because of this, can be the largest single beneficiary of an exit. The good news for virtual companies is that they can rearrange their financial affairs to avoid many of these taxes altogether. They can register in a country with low transaction taxes and may not have to pay the transaction taxes at all. But the quid pro quo for this is that the exit transaction, when it happens, will be more complex, and it will likely involve at least 2 or more countries. And that does make for a great deal of complexity. Cross-border acquisitions are complex for the reason that very few tax and M&A lawyers really understand tax law in any foreign jurisdiction, which stands to reason because the tax codes are complicated and arcane and changing constantly. It's enough of a job just to keep up with the changes in your own jurisdiction, let alone try to learn the tax code in a foreign jurisdiction. So this is where investment bankers need to step up and do a superlative job, because they need to assemble and coordinate lawyers for tax and for M&A in each jurisdiction that the transaction will touch. And it can be a challenge to find them and make sure that you've got the best one and to make sure that they're working together. But when they do, it's really a sight to behold, because these folks are very, very sharp. They can be very creative in coming up with a tax structure that takes care of all of the nuances of the tax rules in the various jurisdictions, and they often can break new ground in doing it, all to the advantage of the sellers who are trying to minimize the tax that they pay on exit. There's a couple of other things that I think are impacting mergers and acquisitions of tech companies today. First, I think it's fair to say that the large tech companies have done very well in the last decade. They've grown tremendously. They're very profitable. And in some people's minds, maybe they've grown too powerful and too large. And I suspect we may see antitrust review starting to rear its head again as legislators and administrators look at acquisitions of early stage tech companies by the large tech firms to make sure that it's in the national interest, which it may be a good thing, but it does mean that M&As will be harder to consummate. The other thing that's happening is more on the international field. Certainly, trade restrictions are growing. Globalization is starting to unwind, and the governments are getting increasingly concerned about the leakage of technology outside their borders. And of course, a cross-border acquisition of a tech company is one of the ways that this can happen. So we can probably look to see more scrutiny on M&A deals involving tech companies going forward. But again, the good news for virtual companies is that they can avoid many of these reviews and restrictions by domiciling in a jurisdiction with fewer regulations, so they're just not subject to them. A tremendous advantage of being virtual, of course. Now, let's talk about the math of mergers and acquisitions. A lot of this will be familiar to you for sure. You've been through this before. But let's look at, from a buyer's perspective, how they come to do a calculation of the acquisition price. And it's typically the normalized EBITDA times multiple. Probably no news to anybody here. Normalizing is adjusting the EBITDA to remove one-time events and to make the projections as if the buyer were running the business on their own. The multiple is a little more nuanced. Lots of things feed into it. First of all, it's based on growth. Obviously, the faster that your revenues or your EBITDA is growing, then the more the acquirer will pay for that. But there are other considerations that come into play. The current M&A market sentiment, as Basil has been talking about, has a tremendous effect of affecting the valuation either up or down. How predictable the EBITDA is. The more predictable the EBITDA, the more they can rely on it, and the more the acquirer will pay for it. How agile is the team, and how strong is the team? Things we talked about earlier in this presentation. How capital efficient is the company? I mean, how much more money does it take to generate the next dollar of profit? That's a significant consideration for an acquirer. Resilience is important, and the good news for virtual companies is that they've been virtually entirely resistant to the pandemic because there's no office to go to spread the virus or to pick it up. And of course, the strategic fit with the buyer is important as well. So for the buyer, the acquisition is normalized EBITDA times multiple. So carrying that forward, now we look at the founder's side of the table, and they have a couple of other things that they're concerned about. One is F%, or the percentage of equity that's held by the founders, which affects how much money that they will earn in this transaction. And T are the exit taxes we've been talking about. So the good news is that virtual companies outperform bricks and mortar companies on virtually every term. Typically, the EBITDA is higher, the multiple is higher, the founders retain more of the equity, and T, the taxes are lower, so 1 minus T is higher. And why is that? And this is where we're spending some time on the research right now. We don't have hard data on this one, but if we can do a thought experiment on this to look at why EBITDA is higher for virtual companies. Lower global compensation costs, as we've talked about. I mean, if you're paying your development team in Bangladesh 10% of what the bricks and mortar company next to you is paying in the Valley, I mean, clearly you're saving lots of money and generating a higher EBITDA. And you can do the same type of analysis for other line items here, the facilities, the administration costs. How much more valuable is it to have greater operational efficiency inside your virtual company? And so adding these all up, it might stand to reason, it's possible that the total increase in EBITDA could be as high as 50%. We've certainly seen that happen. But why is the multiple higher for virtual companies? Well, this is a little more nuanced. And in fact, there's another factors that affect this. We talked about hiring the best global talent from around the world. So if you've got the strongest team in the world, then your acquirer might pay more for your company. If you're able to grow faster, they certainly will, as we've talked about. The fact that they're remotely manageable and so easier to come to decisions means that they can take a better advantage of operations down the road and make more money for the acquirer after the acquisition is done. We've talked about less founder distraction for funding because they're raising less money, which means the founder's spending more time managing the business, and therefore the business should thrive more. And you can apply those kinds of considerations to the other items on this list. And in total, might it be possible that the multiple could be 40% higher for a virtual company over a bricks and mortar company? We've talked about the founders keeping a bigger piece of the equity. If they're not having to raise as much money, they won't get diluted as much. And so let's use an example of a virtual company where the founders retain 50% of the equity versus the bricks and mortar companies where after several rounds of financing, the founders are only retaining 20%. We've talked about the transaction taxes. If a virtual company is incorporated in a tax-friendly zone, then maybe none of these transaction taxes are exigible. So let's now plug in some arithmetic to see how this might work. So if you start with a bricks and mortar company that has an EBITDA of 5 million and a multiple of 5, then their acquisition price obviously is 5 times 5, 25 million. But let's look at the virtual company. Their EBITDA is 50% more, their multiple is 40% more, and when you multiply all of that together, then the acquisition price is $52.5 million, or roughly 2.1 times more for the virtual company than for the bricks and mortar company. This is pretty remarkable, but For the founders, it gets even better. In the bricks and mortar company, if the founders have retained 20% and are paying 25% in transaction taxes, then doing the math, the founders will earn $3.75 million from their exit. The comparable virtual company, though, their founders are retaining 50%. They're not paying transaction taxes, so they are earning $31.5 million from their exit, which is 8 times more than for a virtual company. Now, admittedly, these numbers are pretty compelling, and they may be too good to be true, so we should pour a little bit of cold water in the beer and take a look at this more closely. And again, we're going to be doing this with UBC to see if we can put some real numbers to this. But let's observe and acknowledge that not every virtual company has all of the advantages that we've been talking about, and many of those advantages are overlapping. So I think it's fair to say that the increase in Ebitda and multiple won't be 50 and 40%. It might be something less than that. But we're confident in suggesting that the exit price for a virtual company is probably 50 to 150% more than for a bricks and mortar company. And the founders are likely to earn 100 to 300% more in comparison to bricks and mortar. And again, I said we're working with UBC to quantify these numbers a little more accurately. But here's the implication for entrepreneurs, the folks that you're funding. If they're understanding this research as an entrepreneur looking to start a tech company, would you rather start a bricks and mortar company or a virtual company? And I think as this information becomes more well known, I think we'll see many more virtual companies being formed in the next few years. So I'd like to finish by talking about a virtual company that Strategic Exit sold a little while ago, because it brings to the fore some of the things that we've been talking about. This was a data analytics company, and I wish I could tell you more about them, but we're under a strict NDA, so this is all I can tell you. But I can tell you that it was founded by a millennial digital nomad. This was an interesting fellow. He and his wife would move every week or 2 weeks from city to city, and hole up in an Airbnb when they got there, plug in their computers, and start to manage the company online. He was a true digital nomad. He really had no fixed address when we met him. Even more interestingly, he had no formal training in software, and he taught himself enough of it to understand how to bring his data analytics application to bear. His company was bootstrapped. He raised no external financing at all. He completed the software development and launched the company inside of a year, and grew to 40 employees in 3 years. And his was a case study in how to build a strong team. He built a management team with other experienced digital nomads that had the experience and who could plug into the company and add value very quickly with a minimal amount of supervision, which is a great advantage when you're a virtual company, because even with all of the constant communication, you cannot be everywhere at all times. Well, particularly if you're a digital nomad and traveling around the world. So he hired only the elite developers. If you couldn't prove that you could crack code inside of a week, then you were history. He made sure that he had the best people at all times. And he specifically wanted to hire people who were committed to the virtual work culture, because it was a part of their identity. And as a result of this careful selection, he had a very tight team of smart, self-starting workers who were responsible, accountable, and required minimal oversight. So after 2 years, the company was quickly growing, highly profitable, and the founder decided it was time to take some money off the table. It's probable that he read Basil's early book on early exits. Anyway, he looked for an investment banker to sell the company, and he chose Strategic Exits. In large part, I think, because we've had decades of operational experience in tech companies, and we were experienced with virtual company exits. So there was a meeting of the minds between our client and ourselves, and we worked together very well. And I'd have to say, and Basil can help me with this, that amongst all of the CEOs that we've worked with over the years, this one was probably the easiest to work with. It was a real pleasure. So Strategic Exits went to work to find an acquirer for the company, and we went around the globe. We looked at several hundred of them, and we found several that were interested in making a bid for the company. But one in particular had some domain experience in the digital analytics space where our company competed, and so they were immediately drawn to the company, and they were especially impressed by the founder, who had bootstrapped the team from startup and built a very strong team, and in a very short period of time had grown a very successful company that made an immediate impact in a large market. So they perceived the value, and to short circuit the bidding process, they made a very attractive preemptive offer that didn't take us very long to recommend acceptance. It was quite extraordinary. And they did something else that was interesting. They signed a letter of intent with a commitment to close in 60 days. And for those of you that have been through an exit, you know that that's a pretty brave commitment to make, because closings usually take a lot longer than that. But they were prepared to commit to it, and we were prepared to hold them to it. And as it happened, the exit, or the transaction, was relatively easy to close. Because they were a virtual company, they didn't have that many records, and all of them were electronic and easy to access. So it only took us a couple of days to assemble a virtual data room and review all of the documents. It went very, very smoothly. The interesting part was when it came to the site visit. And as you know, this is typically a key moment in the M&A process, where the buyer's diligence team comes to town, and every conversation and every meeting has to be tightly scripted to make sure that the best features of the companies are on display at all times. But how do you do a site visit when there's no head office? Well, we did the next best thing. We pulled out a map and figured out where the greatest concentration of employees were, and we flew the C team, and the buyers flew their diligence team to that place, and we holed up in a hotel room for a couple of days, going through all of the diligence. This was clearly in the pre-pandemic days. What became apparent to us after that, we got all the diligence done, of course, but the fact that we could spend some time in less formal format, chatting over dinners and lunches, the teams began to appreciate that they were compatible and could work very well together. And we think that that was a key point in making the deal come together as easily as it did. So from our side, as strategic exits, we assembled a strong exit team. We chose the M&A counsel with cross-border experience, because there were 3 jurisdictions that were in play here, and we needed that expertise. We hired an international tax strategist who was able to provide the overall strategy of how best to conduct the transaction. And we had teams of lawyers in each of the 3 jurisdictions who sweat the details of how the tax strategy needed to come together. So they worked very hard, and they broke new ground. It was fascinating to watch the process. The deal was complex. It took hundreds of documents to close the transaction, and there was a point, I have to say, where I wasn't sure that they were actually going to make it, because it was 5 days to close. There were still dozens of documents that had not even been produced, let alone reviewed. But they put their nose to the grindstone and worked over the night a couple of times. And when the smoke cleared, they had closed the transaction not in 60 days, but in 40 days. It was really a remarkable achievement, and it's a crack team, and I'd be happy to work with them on the next acquisition. So there were some interesting components of what we think was a very successful sale. The company was bootstrapped with no investment. It developed and launched its global data analytics application within a year. It rapidly grew and generated significant profits, and it successfully sold in the 3rd year with only 40 employees. And the transaction value for this was more than 125 million Canadian dollars. It was really a significant win for everybody all around. And the reasons that we looked to is that because it was a virtual company, it had a higher exit price for the reasons that we've been talking about. The teams worked very hard, especially our client. They hired elite employees who had a strong work ethic and supported the virtual work style. And we had a world-class exit team, including M&A advisors, tax strategists, and lawyers who were able to take a complex transaction, render it to paper, and get it closed within a record period of time. So with that, we come to the summary that virtual companies sell for more money, and the founders retain more of the proceeds. And with that, I'll end the presentation and turn it over for questions. Thank you.
Oh, great, David. Thank you for the insights. We have a couple questions out there. I'll start with one real quick. Can you speak to the idea what we have a nice sponsor partnership with TMX Group, which is out of Toronto, and their shared view with some of the NASDAQ small market folks that I've talked to are looking at us as well, that they're seeing companies very much looking at their stock now as currency, to go hunting and fishing in this pond that we all swim in as angel investors because of some of the reasons actually you described. There's some of these smaller companies with the unique plug-in technology or some unique things that are on their roadmap in the future that they can buy with stock more cheaply than build themselves. Can you comment on that? And then we'll go to some other questions.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. This is a phenomenon that you see in, I think, every cycle in, with mergers and acquisitions. That as time progresses, companies, find it cheaper to use their equity to buy companies than to pay in cash. The challenge is where we are in the market cycle. So when the markets are exciting and there's lots of growth ahead, then companies or founders are more likely to want to take equity and participate in the upside of their acquiring the company. But in current times, as Basil's alluded to in his talk, times are very, very uncertain. And, we've had a massive run up over the past decade and, a cratering about 3 months ago, largely come back. But, the rebound has been based on infusions of massive amounts of liquidity, which is not sustainable. So if I were a founder today looking to sell a company, I'd be very loath to take very much of it in equity because the uncertainty of what's going to happen to that equity is, would dominate my thinking. So where it's always easier, I think, for an acquirer to put their paper on the table as a currency, I think the founders need to think very carefully about that, particularly given that there's hold periods that you have to hold the stock for a period of time before you can sell it. It increases the risk, so it's something to mull over very carefully.
Thank you for that. And Basil, since you're in the room too, when we have multiple questions, which we do from Gajanan, and if you can unmute yourself, Gajanan, your question for David first, and then your question for Basil while we have you unmuted.
So the question for David, did you say virtual companies pay less in income tax? And does that mean that you pay less tax in the revenue generated? Maybe you have already answered that question, but I will appreciate if you can explain that.
Okay. What I was referring to was the distinction between bricks and mortar companies and virtual companies, and where they're domiciled. If you're domiciled onshore, then you're paying a corporate income tax, and which could be 20%, maybe higher. But if you're domiciled offshore, you can choose a jurisdiction that doesn't levy very much income tax, and that can be recycled back into the business. So that's a tremendous advantage, of course, for a virtual company that's arranged their affairs that way.
So, yeah, I really enjoy the presentation. I think all this conversation is right in line with what we should be thinking and talking about. Let me talk about the idea of a virtual company and the changes that we're going to see because of the shutdown, hide in place. And it's easy for us geeks to line up a bunch of accounting numbers and declare, hey, if we do this company virtually, it's going to have more value. We can make more money at it. Easier to run. All the reasons you listed were perfect. However, what I see is that the human condition doesn't allow for that. The human condition demands interaction. Human condition has evolved over thousands of years. Turns out, I may have the company right here, Google's CEO allowed employees to work at home because that had become an unspoken tradition with them. So she made a declaration, okay, everybody go home, work at home. And then she turned around and stopped that immediately and said, oh, come back. Everybody has to work back at the office here. And I think what leaders are realizing is that it's difficult to lead from afar as well as motivate. So when we try and set up a virtual company, I think it's a difficult thing to build and probably a more difficult thing to sustain. And what I'm talking about is how we my declaration is that the internet isn't the tool to change human conditions.
Well, you've raised a number of interesting points, and if I'd had more time, I would have added in a couple of slides that speak to some of your points. You're quite right that virtual remote work is not for everybody. You know, extroverts in particular, you know, thrive, as you mentioned, on you know, face-to-face human interaction. And the worst thing you can do for them is stick them behind a monitor for 8 hours a day. They'll go crazy, and they won't stick around. They can't handle it. So, you know, it isn't for everybody. It's also, you know, challenging if you're bringing new people on board that aren't, you know, familiar with the company. You know, the amount of extra effort that you have to expend because you're in a virtual environment to, you know, to bring them on board and inculcate the company culture into them, include them in the decision-making process. That's why I emphasized a number of times about, you know, the fact that you need over-communication online to keep people feeling included within the organization. So is it hard to sustain it? It depends on how you approach it. You certainly can't use big company techniques in a virtual company. That just doesn't work, and we talked about that a little bit during the presentation. But by choosing, if you have the option to choose experienced people that have worked in a virtual environment before, obviously that's going to work a lot better. So the things to you know, to think about are that you know, there's dangers with extroverted people, with people who are new to the organization and need a lot of extra training. It is incumbent upon the managers to appreciate this and to go out of their way to keep people in the loop. So, you know, I don't think I agree with the sentiment that says the managers can't do this. I think they can, but they have to be committed to it and understand that it's going to require, you know, X plus 50% of their time and effort in order to make it work. And, you know, among the 140 companies that were interviewed by Remote.co, this was the theme that came up, that constant online communications was the key to making those companies work. And some of them are doing extremely well. You know, over 100 employees. In one case, there's a real estate company located on the West Coast that has over 2,000 people working in it remotely. So it can be done, but it is a hard job.
Great question, Chris. Great answer, Dave.
Yeah.
Good response.
Good stuff to talk about. This is fantastic. Dr. Roberta Lee, you're unmuted and love to hear from you.
Yes, and thank you for another wonderful talk. My question was on these virtual companies as well. And I mean, you're talking about going overseas or OUS to have headquarter them, but do the founders or CEO have to live in these foreign countries then?
That's a very simple question with a long and complicated answer. Let's say this is that an aspect that we didn't get into in this talk was on personal taxation and a personal tax strategy. And there's a number of issues around that with respect to jurisdiction, time spent, attachments to the jurisdiction in which you pay your taxes. These are things that are complex, and there's advisors who have whole businesses about advising people how to do this easily. So the short answer to the question is no, you don't have to live there. You can choose, you can have the company headquartered in one location while you declare your place of taxation in a different location, but you do have to follow the rules and you do have to pay your fair share of taxes in the way that the rules require.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Roberta. Renu, great to see you. And Sylvia, you're on deck. Renu, your question and who it's for, David or Basil.
Thanks for the interesting talk. I wanted to pitch in and say that I've been running a virtual company for the last 5 years with about 6 to 9 employees spread out all over the world. And I use technology to monitor all of them and communicate with all of them throughout the day. So I have about 8 or 9 laptops set up where it's very interactive, and you know, we kind of all interact on different services like messenger services throughout the day. So it's been quite effective.
Sylvia, and you're up, and then Siva, you're on deck.
Okay, I agree with the comment of human condition. Like I work for Cisco for over 20 years. We have doing working virtually forever. And I manage a global team. So I have people in Europe, I have people in Asia and Latin America. And yes, you can do virtual things. And I don't mind if when I'm talking with them, they're at the beach or not. I need to manage by objective. What are the key things they need to do with them? But believe me, I need to be in front of them too. If I go to a country manager in France, so I go to what I'm able to achieve at a dinner time or in a meeting one-on-one, sometimes it's incredible in comparison to all the meetings that I had before. So for me, sometimes we go too extreme. Oh, now everything is virtual. I think it's a combination of to make things effective in how you're going to manage those teams. I have been doing this for over 20 years, and I know one way it does not work.
Well, I think you're right. And, you know, again, if I'd had more time to add more slides, I'd have pointed out that those companies that were reviewed by Remote.co asked them, you know, well, what about physical get-togethers? And almost all of them say that as good as your remote communications can be, you still need to pull everybody together at least once and maybe twice a year to you know, have those face-to-face interactions to build the bond stronger, to make sure that everybody's working in the same direction, much as you have been doing. So that exactly falls into you know, the culture of remote work for sure.
Oh, absolutely. So it needs to be said because you build trust in a very different way, and you achieve a lot of things out of these one-on-ones. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Sylvia. And Siva, your
Yeah,
question.
David, thank you so much. And I don't want to get into debate of virtual remote locations and all. But let me ask you, for an employee right now, for a corporation working at a high cost of living, if we can show a path for them that they will save more money in terms of moving to a small town, and they're willing to do it, how would you propose or how would you approach for an existing employee, existing company? So it's
You know,
taking a little bit tangential from your whole talk,
yeah.
but I'm curious what will happen.
We're starting to see that in the commentary happening right now. You know, corporations that figure out what, you know, that they're forced to send their employees to work from home. They find out, hey, there's some advantages to this. It's not so bad, and they calculated that they can save in urban locations about $12,000 per person per year if they weren't sitting at a desk downtown, if they could be in a you know, in a more remote location.
That was good.
So what's starting to happen is that you know, companies that pay their employees you know, significant amounts of money because their cost of living is higher living in an urban core, they're saying, well, wait a minute, you don't have to be here. You could be in a, you know, in a small town. Maybe you like living in a small town where the expenses are less, and you know, we won't pay you as much. So I think that you know, this is starting to work its way through the system, definitely.
So you could see some metrics or tools or to identify a certain type of personality, a certain type of job titles, and tell them you're going to the boonies now. You're not here anymore. You know, you know how would a corporation do it if they have to take that path?
I mean, what's the formula? I don't know. Would they look at the cost of living in a basket, compare it between the two locations, and say, well, if you're moving to Patunk Heights, then your basket's only 2/3 as expensive, so we're going to reduce your salary by 2/3. I don't know, but you know, these kinds of considerations are going to start coming to the fore. The idea of cost of living adjustments for working in urban areas where the cost of living is high, I think we're going to start to see those disappear.
Great, thank you. So we have a couple more questions here, and we're going to go to Mahinder and then Michael, and then we'll hand it off to Randy for closing remarks.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you. David, fantastic presentation. Really appreciate that. My question is a simple one, I think. In this environment where most startups are starved for cash, having difficulty in raising funds, do you see opportunities for mergers between startups through equity swaps? Or do you see more and more corporates buying technology companies because they are kind of looking towards the future and they're looking towards a good, easy way of acquiring technology companies?
So two options that you suggested: corporate mergers of early stage companies, and then large companies acquiring small ones. I think that you know, when financing is hard, you know, people will look to find money any way they legally can, and so they'll look at different options. But you know, combining companies, I think maybe to share overheads. You know, you might save some money doing that, but you save a lot more money if you never had the office in the first place and you just started up at home and did it virtually, so that you cut your expenses to you know, to the bare bone. You know, as I said, you know, the example we gave you of that $125 million exit, that fellow raised no external financing at all. He was able to build his business strictly remotely and avoid, you know, exactly the problem that you're talking about. That's why I think that virtual companies are going to become more and more prevalent. You know, in our business of selling tech companies, it's you know, this could be a long discussion, but I think it's fair to say that until the small company has demonstrated its value proposition through not just the acceptance of its technology, but also by a series of repeated sales, I don't think the large company is going to be interested. They want the technology and the technology risk and the early commercialization risk to be done by the company before they'll take a look at it. You would rather wait and pay more when it's more firmly established than to take a risk and buy it early. So I'm not expecting to see those kinds of solutions come in the near term.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Mahinder. Great to have you. And Michael, nice to see you. And your question, Michael, and for who?
Probably Dave. I mean, it's an observation. It's an open-ended question, which is to think a little bit about productivity and management. I'm in the camp of what's been said in the past few minutes, not in the camp of great, that this trend is going to stay. The companies are going to find costs less expensive, and that this trend towards virtual workplaces is going to continue. There is another reality, which is a trend towards distance learning in families is going to continue, because even once kids come back to school, there's going to be physical distancing and smaller classes, and kids are going to be home more. And that's a reality of many of the management and personnel in companies are going to be working from home and trying to manage kids. So as executives or as investors in companies, what do we expect for how the culture in which people will get things done when they're at home managing families that are at home too? That's just the new reality until there's a vaccine.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, in the state of lockdown that we're just starting to come out of now, you know, the home has had to, you know, fulfill a number of different requirements. It's the place you live, but then it becomes the place you work. And because the kids have all been sent home from the daycare and the schools, it becomes the daycare facility as well as the classroom. And this, frankly, has been driving a lot of parents around the bend. They're exhausted because they're on call 24/7 because everything is happening right around them all of the time. That's not going to continue because, you know, at some point the restrictions will be lifted and we'll get into some kind of new normal. So, you know, it depends what kind of child care arrangements did they have before, and how did they get their kids to and from school. I think that with the virtual company arrangement, because there's more flexibility around hours, then there's more of an opportunity for the parents to take their kids to the daycare, take them to school, pick them up when it's time, without trying to manage this from remote control from their office 20 miles away. So I think right now it's very difficult, but I think as we get to the new normal, it's going to become easier. And as I said in the presentation, I think virtual operations with flexible hours is going to solve a lot of problems for a lot of people in this area.
There's got to be a bunch of companies that come out of this that need your expertise, David and Basil. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you again for inviting us. It's always a pleasure to be part of Keiretsu. You guys are funding the companies that are going to build our economic future. I think it's important and exciting. Thank you again.
Thank you. Funding the future.
It's exciting for me to see the development of Keiretsu along with Basil. I was one of the original members of Keiretsu when it first came to Vancouver, I guess in the last decade, and it certainly has grown in size and impact. It's wonderful to see.